Welcome everyone. Hey Chris, how you doing?
Okay, how are you?
Good, good. Chris, meet Tony.
Hi, Tony.
Hello, Chris. Peace to you. I'm Tony.
Good to meet you.
It's good to meet you. And then Kevin, what's up? How are you?
Oh, hi. Thanks. Fine.
I don't think I know you, Kevin.
No, I'm from Frankfurt. I just participated in your talk last week
Oh, cool.
on Zoom at the Ethnologische Verein Südtirol or something like that. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Welcome. Hey Astrid.
Hello.
Hey Anne. Hey
Hi.
Connie. Everybody meet Tony.
Hello.
Hey, everybody. I'm Tony.
Hey.
And hey Neo, I don't think I know what kind of stuff you work on. Welcome. Oh. Hello.
Yeah.
Hey.
Who asked
Do you-
Astrid?
Neo, do you care to say something about your?
Hi. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Sorry, I
totally.
couldn't hear you.
Totally.
I'm, well, it's nice to meet you all. I'm a friend of Melanie's, and I'm a musician. I'm based in Cape Town.
Very cool. Welcome.
And I was just curious about your conversation. So thank you for the invitation.
I'm glad you can join. What kind of music do you make?
A large spectrum. I write operas, but I also make indigenous Southern African music, and I tour and I perform, and I make sound installations.
Very cool.
That sounds dope. It's good to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all. I'm Mel.
And Adriana, I don't think I've seen you here before. Do you want to say something about your work and your interest in the group?
Oh, wow, just gonna throw me right in there, huh? So, hi everyone, I'm a new member of the group. I'm a cultural anthropologist specializing in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. And my emphasis is on the sociopolitical context of epidemics. And I've also been doing work around climate change in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean and in relation to small farming. So I'm very much interested in multi-species relations. Thanks for having me.
Welcome. Great to have you. And Rachel, who helped set this up, I think you're joining us by phone. Oh no, you're on a proper video connection. Hey Rachel, thanks for helping make this happen.
Hi, Rachel. I know she said she was going to be on a slower internet connection.
Yeah, she said community Wi-Fi is.
Yeah, definitely. So we'll say hello to Rachel from a few seconds ago.
And Michelle, welcome. Do you want to say something about your work, Michelle?
Hi, yes, I just got up. My name is Michelle Rensel. Rachel Vaughn, I was supposed to say even Rachel Vaughn shared the link with me. I work with her at UCLA. And nice to see you, Tony. We had Tony in the Biotechnology and Society cluster, our course this past year. So I'm a biologist working on stress physiology, but I also teach in the same institute with Rachel Vaughn, the Institute for Society and Genetics, and super interested in hearing today from you, Tony. So I'm going to turn my video off because I look like I just woke up. But
That's okay.
Thank you so much for
Hi,
having
Michelle.
me. Hi, nice to see you, Tony.
Good to see you.
Great to meet you, Michelle. And,
Yeah,
and
that was a
Lucy,
fun visit.
how recently were you out there?
That was just this year. I feel like, I mean, time is of course doing strange things. Like I'm
Yeah.
like, I have to ask myself, did it happen in 2020? And I have to really give myself pause. But that was just earlier this year. In the before time. It really was in the before time. And we were discussing some stuff from Silent Cells, my recent book, Silent Cells.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Lucy, do you want to say anything about your work?
Sure. Hi everyone. I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology at Berkeley. And actually I just taught a course on race and racialization this summer, and I recommended Catherine Bliss's book, Tony, which you mentioned in one of your pieces that you sent around. And so we discussed a lot of these issues that you're talking about. Obviously, given the time that the course was virtual, as you might imagine. So we discussed a lot of these issues related to the racialization of medicine and genetic research in particular. So I'm very excited for this.
All right. Well, I think go ahead, Tony.
I was going to say, it's very nice to meet you and hear about that work. Yeah, Catherine's book is amazing.
It is, yeah. So thank you, Tony, for joining us. I think there's a critical mass here today. We have two pieces on the table to discuss. Both are super timely. And before we get into the specifics of the things that you talk about in the piece, do you have any reflections that you'd like to share, or do you want to contextualize these pieces in terms of your broader research trajectory?
I mean, that may be helpful for people, and for me to say a little bit more about who I am and what I'm doing now. So again, I'm Tony Hatch, and I'm a sociologist. And I'm the chair and associate professor of science and society at Wesleyan in Connecticut. And there, the Science and Society program is a kind of a small interdisciplinary science studies major for undergraduates only, no graduate program, thank you, for us. And so, but I offer courses in sociocultural studies of science, medicine, and technology. And some of those courses are really interpolated with ideas from critical race thought and intersectionality, environmental studies increasingly, and I have appointments in those other areas as well as in sociology. So these two pieces are interesting because I didn't really see them as fitting within a context. And so this invitation has kind of forced me to kind of think about what I'm up to now, right? Like really how do these kind of provocations, which is really all I saw them as, being invited to offer some comments and then saying some things and then thinking, okay, what did I just say? Right, going back and rereading this work, right, actually has really been an invitation to really go back and really sort of think about, what I think is a persistent worry on my part about kind of race, like racial data, for lack of a better term, like racialized data, and the kind of ethical problem of that data in terms of anti-racism, right? So there's these two pieces. Later this summer, I'm going to be giving remarks at both 4S and at ASA in virtual settings, the American Sociological Association. And so I'm kind of, literally between when I wrote these pieces and kind of later this summer, going to really need to think through, like, how is racial data being produced relative to, I think I'm going to take on the case of COVID-19. I mean, I think this is the kind of case that's presenting itself. A lot of my work is kind of case-driven, comparative. I feel much more like a comparative historical sociologist than I ever did like an STS scholar per se. But taking on the case of COVID and really raising what I think is the question that is coming to me, which is, everyone assumes that we need more data and that the data will save us, but I don't think it will. And I think that in fact, it's really a supposition really that the production of the data and its dissemination is actually making the problem worse. And so, there's a particular issue relative to COVID, but then there's also a much broader question, which is, what has racial health disparities science got us? Like over the last 50 years of people doing research on race and racism and health, discovering really important things, for example, right? That it's not genetic or biological, the disparities that we see. We can prove that sociologically now, right? We know this. But, what has that actually, materially meant for Black bodies, for brown bodies in terms of health? Health inequalities are just as bad as they've ever been, as far as I can see. They seem to be really intractable. So I just kind of want to ask a series of questions around the relationship between kind of this racial data and the call for it, the need for what kind of data is being produced of all kinds, and an anti-racist approach to health, right? Really wanting to end once and for all, as is so often claimed, racial disparities in health. You can't end them just by a magic wand. And I don't think you can necessarily end them with more science. And I'm kind of wrestling with that, and I think if that helps to provide some context for it, that might be helpful. And I'm specifically thinking of Neo, again, maybe new to the conversation, and that was that here in the United States, it seemed to me to be the case that once it was learned, that once it became public information that African Americans, Latinos were disproportionately impacted by COVID. Like that the death rates were higher, right? Rates of hospitalization were higher, death rates were higher. But somehow the federal government seemed to really back off on, it was really at that moment that the federal government seemed to pull back from, what was, I think at that point, the plan to roll out testing, right? To really get things going. They kind of said, well, we will leave it up to the states to figure it out. So, and I was just, it just seems like just a puzzling, coincidence that troubled me when I wrote at least the piece in the two meditations. So, and then had me go back and think about what was the response back in 1917, 18? How did we confront that? And brought me to this other work of Professor Gamble, which I thought was really interesting to look at this time. So I'm not really sure, how, to me, doing detailed casework takes crazy time. So actually really going through and looking at all of the science that's been produced and sequencing it all historically, really thinking about this genealogy, if you will, of this particular kind of claim, linking COVID and racism, really mapping that out is going to take time, right? So it's hard to, in my experience, it takes a long time to do it. So I have an urgent need to kind of do it pretty quickly, but also, like many of you, I'm tired. I'm trying to survive. I didn't want to write anything at all. I could barely think, confronting the challenges of teaching and my administrative and home life, everything being all fucked up as it is, so those are real ongoing challenges as well.
Thanks, Tony. And it sort of building on that, I really love what you do with necropolitics in the piece and the insistence that it's not just about counting dead bodies. And I think, what you were just saying about the incoherent biopolitical strategies of the Trump administration that might actually have some coherence if you kind of look at ways that a body count might have produced a policy change. I think your piece creates an opening for an anti-racist STS that is more than that. We've been doing the body count for a while now with Nancy Shepherd Hughes, counting the coffins of little babies, and we're creative at counting bodies in absence of visibility, I guess. But now that we have that visibility, I guess maybe what are some of the more imaginative, proactive, anti-racist STS things? And I'm thinking with Ruha Benjamin here. I'm thinking with other folks who are already starting to work in that direction. But do you have any glimmers of where kind of that's headed in your work?
Yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of people we could talk about who have taken on the problem of enumeration. Right, the counting from James Scott, and there's some wonderful work on, of course, Boker and Starr and all the people in STS and philosophy of science traditions, but all anthropology of science. Has been some great work. Several texts that I used to teach in a class on biopolitics and necropolitics at Wesleyan that come to mind. Nelson, I'd have to get the source. But you know, and of course, there's a long tradition going back many decades of thinking about the power of abstraction, right? When in order to count a body, you have to abstract it. Those processes of rendering bodies and other forms of text data. I mean, go back to, you know, there's a long tradition of looking at that in Foucauldian terms and in other terms. That's probably the tradition I'm most familiar with, is the Foucauldian way of thinking about the body as a text, and the number system as a particular form of representation that gets mapped onto bodies, and how the state can then see them in particular ways. But what does it mean to not count, like to ignore the count, or to knowingly not count, like to intentionally not know something in order to let a harm take place, right? I mean, this was the problem in that a part explored in this book, Silent Cells, I just wrote, right? Like, not collecting data and information about the use of psych meds in prisons, you know, makes it possible for them to do extra legal things with those pharmaceuticals in prisons, right? And that's, you know, at least one of the claims that I explore in that book. And you look at the system of knowledge production about the drugging, and you see where it has all these gaps. Like, there's certain things that you can't know. And I think that's intentional. And so in this case, you're kind of reversing that. So to ask, you know, what are the consequences? How is the knowledge of the disparity inserted into, you know, the ongoing racist program of the Trump era, right? I mean, it's an ongoing and flexible situation that they are responding day to day, right? There's no plan. They're just kind of making it up, making the next racist move they can, right? With every single step, it seems. So, I mean, how, you know, it seems almost conspiratorial, but I'm trying to think about who in the world is, you know, thinking about these are much more epistemological questions, you know, than they are necessarily technical ones, I think.
Mm-hmm. So other folks, feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in with your own questions. I've got at least one more queued up that I might go ahead with, unless anyone else wants to jump in. Rachel?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, everybody. And hi, Tony. It's so nice to see you and hear you. And thanks for being with us. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more with us about that kind of entire genealogy that you outline in your first book on metabolic syndrome. You reference it in one of the pieces for today. And I was just thinking that, you know, maybe talking a little bit more about some of those very common scientific premises that are governing that entire genealogy could invite further discussion for this group as we think through kind of coronavirus and taxonomies and things like this. Yeah. Because what is so striking to me about your work in that book is how each piece sort of domino affects the next and builds on the next and the next and the next and carries forward these premises that you just kind of you really just sort of obliterate from in the beginning of the text in this wonderful and critical way. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about some of those kind of common premises that govern that entire syndrome, because I do think that maybe we can flesh out some more from coronavirus publications as they just are coming out so quickly.
Yeah. So and it's so good to hear your voice, and you know, and for people who don't know, Rachel and I met as part of the Edible Feminisms Project at UCLA a few years ago, and resulted in a really wonderful edited volume of Food Culture and Society that I would point people to for all sorts of interesting insights of metabolic analysis. I just really love it. So what Rachel's referring to in Blood Sugar, which is my dissertation and then book that came out in 2016, I looked at, it was essentially a genealogy of metabolic syndrome. And so for people who are unfamiliar, very quickly, genealogy is this term that has multiple meanings. In the book, I use genealogy as a research methodology, drawing heavily upon the work of the philosopher and historian Michel Foucault and all of his interpreters. And the genealogy is a certain way of looking at, a certain way of critiquing, a certain way of producing a kind of a counter history, a certain way of looking at the past. And to be like really specific about it, as I report it's like genealogy was an anti-science, right? He wasn't trying to say, this is the truth. He's trying to say, how did these people think they were speaking the truth? How was it that these people thought that they were, making claims? And how do you actually, as a methodological project, show a reader that's what they were doing when they, that's what they were thinking when they wrote the things that they did, right? And so, in my rendering, genealogy was this historical methodology that had us look for moments in the history of a discourse when we can identify where, things changed. There were these kind of shifts in meaning, right? What I call in the book disjunctures, right? You're say, for example, in 1962, you get one article that says one thing, but by 1965, things have changed, the meaning has changed, well, why? And then you go back and you try to figure out what that was. And so what I did you both trace a process of emergence, right? You look to see, well, when were all these moments this discourse popped up? Not that any one of them was the first, or that any one of them was the best, or any of them was like the purest articulation of what the thing was, but rather they just kind of play in this field of power in this kind of heterogeneous and, non-linear way. And so, it involved telling a kind of a history of that emergence in a way that was compelling. And the other thing you do in a genealogy, in addition to tracing emergence, is you trace the descent of a discourse. And what that means is that you literally document when that discourse came in contact with a body, right? And how it gets mapped onto the body, how the body's signs and signals then get interpolated into what the discourse means, right? So you surveil the body, you do you test it for various things, weight, and again, in blood sugar, the focus was something called metabolic syndrome, which is a biomedical idea that encompasses the major risk factors for heart disease and stroke. And so you measure for these things all the time. They're part of your basic vital signs, and all that data gets brought into the rendering of what this concept is. So you track those points of contact between that kind of idea and the body in real material terms, I think, is what Foucault would have us do. So I think what, and as you're tracing when metabolic syndrome, emerged in the scientific discourse, which it did, in under multiple names and under different schema, and you're trying to make sense of something that went from, no one had written about it, let's say in 1920, to by 2001, 2010, thousands and thousands and thousands of publications were produced about this one thing. And it's interesting, COVID certainly has like this crazy exponential trajectory in terms of discursive statements, right? Like it goes from like nothing to like this. I mean, it's just been this explosion of discursive work. And so to disentangle the meanings of all of those like patterns, like again, it's kind of a daunting empirical project. I mean, it actually would be an interesting project for some of these data analytic people, right, who can really pull some of these, kind of quantitative and machine learning assessments of statements. I think some of those more empirical versions of this might be interesting, at least to see patterns in such statements. So that methodology of genealogy wasn't designed for you to, again, produce some, in the case of this work on racism that undergirded this book, it wasn't like I wanted to say, okay, this is why, Black people, have higher rates of metabolic syndrome than any other group, right? I wasn't interested in making those claims at all, right? Although they do, right? It was that, you know, it is by examining the logic of scientific racism that undergirds every single claim that's made, linking race to a body's metabolism, right? Is that you can see throughout that text. Rachel, I don't know if this is meandering toward an answer, but you know, genealogy is the specific, you know, research methodology, I think, a way of thinking about history and about the history of a discourse that I don't think we're done with it. I think genealogy still has some use to it. I think, you know, I'm surprised people don't really talk about it much more explicitly. They should, I think.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah.
Lucy, did you want to jump in?
I was just gonna ask a question that sort of builds off of that. That was also something that I was gonna ask you to expound on a little bit more, but I was interested also, I also like the concept of genealogy, but I was interested also in the sort of critique that you make of it in the piece you sent around, in the sense of saying that, like, the communities that you actually are accountable to didn't particularly care about that concept. And I also do community-based work, and I was wondering if you have any ideas about ways that you could either make that concept more relevant for communities you are accountable to, or sort of alternatives that might also, you know, enable you to produce these sort of counter histories, but in a more sort of accessible, relevant way for non-academics.
It's a good question. I mean, I think probably everybody in this group has grapples with the maybe contradictions between the kinds of currencies academics have to accrue in order to secure a job, tenure, promotion, right? I have to write, you know, to scholarly audiences in some way or the other. My work has to be recognized as making a contribution to certain scholarly literatures. You know, speaking to other scholars, even though I might, and I wrote about this in Blood Sugar. Like I really wasn't sure who I wanted to be writing to in the first place. Of course, I was initially writing to a dissertation committee, right? A committee of 5. Now, they were, as a group, were interested in seeing me write things that had public valence, right? But actually achieving that was much more difficult than I could have ever, and I didn't achieve a kind of public salience, right? But that was a very difficult thing to do, right? And so the contradiction between, on the one hand, needing to do certain kinds of work intellectually to secure a position in this hierarchy, right, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you know, staying true, you know, and speaking to and with those folks that I was most concerned about. And you know, the resolution I'm coming to now is that, like, that my research methodologies as a scholar no doubt shape how I see my object and how I make claims about my object of study, but I might be best served by almost burying the methodology, you know, and not having methodology be, I don't know, as soon as I say it, I'm like, I don't know. Like, the way we tell stories is so important, right? And that's probably more along the lines of what I would say is embracing a discourse of storytelling, as instead of like genealogy, right? It's now storytelling, and you can embrace this again, and that connects you to other kinds of radical traditions of narration and story and that. And meaning for people that are not necessarily as scientistic, right? And don't necessarily confer a kind of scientific legitimacy upon the speaker, right? So by saying I'm doing this fancy ass genealogy, all of a sudden your ears perk up. Either they perk up or they're like, what are you even talking about? Right? Like, my grandma did a genealogy on 23andMe. That's what they know. That's what folks know if they know anything. So, you know, the other thing I'm wrestling with, and I'm sure I'll say this, and I really want to hear from other people, because I want to hear from all of you and learn from what you guys are thinking about right now, is that, you know, I'm not sure what I'm writing next, like actually in terms of what the actual thing is going to be. So the language that you use and kind of how you frame things is very much connected to what you're actually producing. And I'm still thinking through what that might be, whether that's a scholarly piece or contributing to a much larger, like I have been working on something a much larger kind of, much larger project, but I'm not sure what form it will take, you know.
So Tony, these are all wonderful ideas. And for me, I'm holding sort of the techno-optimism of Gilroy of 20 years ago, like against race, you know, technology is going to just make this thing disappear. And also your pessimism of Corona time, which I think many of us share. But also this really clever, interesting move that you're doing in the anti-racism piece. So you're starting to think about anti-racist work in STS as a beautiful life-affirming project that enlivens science and disavows the abject legacy of you know, what others have called racializing assemblages. And I guess maybe it's kind of building on my earlier question, like how do you know, between these poles of pessimism and optimism, like rendering lively futures in this anti-racist space? I'm just wondering what that might look like.
It's such a good question. I mean, and you can see me directly confronting it, you know, and actually for me, it was a breathtaking moment for me to write and then distribute publicly a claim about my profound pessimism about the moment, right? Especially as a teacher, I confront this a lot in my classes, right? Where my students are like, yo, Professor Hatch, can we please have some solutions? It's so horrible. Everything's so horrible. I feel like all of my classes are like a social problem seminar on crack, just like completely, and where you can't even see a way out. And I think that our critiques of, and correspondingly my critique of power that I've been engaged with for however long I've been doing this work, correspondingly has kind of like put me in a box where I can't even see through like what to be hopeful for and how to build with others, right? And so, and that's part of intellectual training, of course, but and part of my institutional positionality where I am. But I think that you know, I want to know as a theoretical matter, on the one hand, does Afro-pessimism offer any insights for thinking about race and health? Like I don't think anyone's really thought about that, because the mattering of Black lives I always see as a very material issue related to the health of people. And so that's just salient in COVID. So what happens when we think about the science of racial health disparities and the politics of racial health disparities from that theoretical vantage point? And is there anything worth excavating in that conversation? I'm curious about that as a theoretical matter. As a practical matter, people are, and this is what's interesting in the Corona time, right? Everybody is, like, you can see on display survival tactics. Like what stands in for living now, right? Like is really in fact surviving. Right. And I'm trying, as I said in my thing, I'm not trying to overachieve, and I'm trying to survive the pandemic. So what am I actually doing, like as a practical matter in my life, pragmatically speaking, literally in terms of cultural and social practices to survive? So what are people doing? Right. So when you start to look at not just the system of domination, and this is not new. I'm not the first person to say this at all, but when you look at those practices of resistance, right, this is coming out of, you know, Black feminist thought, you know, forms of political theory, looking at, you know, what everyday practices of people as they don't die, as they refuse to be killed.
Jump in?
Please, yeah. I think we lost your audio feed, Van. Ooh, the connection's bad. Fan, maybe try typing a message.
Yeah.
It's going to be a really good point. We're all waiting for it.
I know it is too. I totally know that it is.
And it looks like
I
she's
don't-
off. So go ahead, Tony, if you have further thoughts.
I don't want to ramble, but maybe I'll just come to my point that I'm trying to figure out a way to confront my profound pessimism, right? Like I'm trying to find a way to really reckon with that, because I'm not really sure, like, quite honestly, like how I can do the work I'm supposed to be doing and be this sad, right? Like, and be this disrupted. We were talking about the trolls and all the enemies out there that lurk, and they're definitely working hard. They are working hard to make it tough, and I'm glad everybody can see that now. But that's been that's the reality of anti-Black racism. Is like they've been trying for a long time. So now we just see it on video, and I wrote a piece a couple of years ago for Radical History Review. This tiny little commentary piece, another little piece like this, but it was about this technology piece and how the rendering of of anti-Black violence through media makes it possible to resist it, right? From Emmett Till, to Mike Brown, and now we're in even a new moment of that. Another way that technology, plays into this. And this is, to your point about the techno, the pessimism versus techno optimism, and kind of how I see the critique of the data sciences that I'm kind of working toward here as another form of that, right? Either the data is going to save us or it's going to kill us, and either it's saving us and killing us at the same time. And so how do you show that empirically is kind of the question that's before me. Oh, there's Fawn's question.
Fawn, do you want to try to give it a go with the audio?
Yeah, I'll go again. So just continuing with the discussion of survival, and I really had not thought about it until I read your piece, the connection, so many connections about surviving this time in relation to food. And since someone like you and perhaps Rachel as well, who have worked in food studies or food and cultural studies, I'm kind of wondering what kind of research might emerge from this. You kind of briefly mentioned all the manifestations of this crisis through the lens of food, if we're talking about food production and in terms of immigrant labor or distribution in terms of the grocery stores, the essential workers, and the kinds of privileged workers like us who get pretty much tired of talking about the next meal that we have to cook and the mass mediated spread of food cooking. And so there seems to be quite a bit of disparity, but also connectivity that we may explore. So I'd just like to hear more from people who are experts in this. Thank you.
I really would love for Rachel to chime in too, but that's such a great question. And in my home, my wife, and I have it's a running heart. It's not even a joke. It's just it speaks to this kind of sad irony. It's like, did you pull the fish out for dinner yet? Right? Like it's just this kind of, it's that we know the fish is in the fridge. We bought, what I mean? Like the enormous privilege attached to this moment. I have to be like, and it's probably evident in this piece, this is just a personal note, and then we can talk more about the structural food question. But, I wrote this piece at a time when, I was, like many of you, probably still really reeling from the spring, and was just completely beaten down from what the spring had done. And I also was, just personally, having, other health challenges, not Corona related, but in some ways related to inflammation, that were compounding those pressures. And so it was really difficult, like to move through that moment. And the way time was passing, like I knew that there was we were joking before, like a before time and now a Corona time, like it's a new moment. And we are, I think, in some ways, as was asked about Trump and anti-science, like in what ways the the past will be continuous and discontinuous from what's coming forward. And the food system was one axis of power that structured what Corona time would look like. So everybody, for example, was instantly made aware of how extraordinarily dependent we are upon food companies and the supply chain. You know what I mean? That supply chain slows up, you're stuck. And everybody realized that. And it was just this remarkable recognition, transparency to that form of biopower, right? It's just like everybody knows if they stop doing this work, we die or we starve. And of course that is of course happening all the time, all around the world, but you would just see it differently here in the United States. Rachel, what do you think about that, Rachel?
I thought that, yeah, thanks, Ron, for asking that. I guess, food has, to me, I think the most profound thing for me in this, as somebody who studies both food or the kind of production end, but also the waste end or the metabolized end of things, is just how food has been used as such a profound weapon. And I don't think that in this particular moment, and not that is new or surprising to me in my own body of research, but just how much more explicitly it was made in this particular moment. And at the same time, how much it has further proven those of us who are so pessimistic about capitalism in general, and like any of its use value, it's just sort of coming to light now more than ever. And again, not new, just looking different. And I think it's been interesting to me to sort of hear folks who are not food scholars, who are coming from a much broader public, suddenly really wanting to talk a lot more about this and seeing this more viscerally. I wanted to say though that you kind of hearken to a point in your anti-racism and STS research, where you're talking about Foucault's genealogy, and kind of that point where you say it didn't offer me a way to produce knowledge that was useful in these moments. And you talked about wanting to more explicitly address the Du Boisian approach as a way to kind of think about new alternative truths and perhaps reaching broader non-academic readers and listeners. And I was struck by the fact, on a food front, I was really struck by the fact that as I was reading this, I was thinking to myself, but you do that in the final chapter of that book, and it's so clear that you are trying to again turn that question about food, and in this case a particular metabolic syndrome and how it's been in the science being used against people, and to turn that around, and you do it in sugar ecology, in your piece on sugar ecologies. You are really grappling with these community dynamics in very material ways. You're so hard on yourself in the writing. I think that was what was so striking to me as I was reading this piece again. And I guess to link it then to Yvonne's question again, was that this is a profoundly important moment for revisiting the power of mutualism and mutual aid specifically related to food. We're starting to see now more than ever and hopefully this continues, investment in Black and brown growers in the projects that have already been going on for a really freaking long time. Yeah. And I do see in the cynicism, in the pessimism of that, I see this beautiful hope in that people are already doing this food work and this mutual aid in their communities in really profound and impactful ways. And I'm seeing that being amplified even more in this moment. I don't know, I'm not sure where to what ends yet, or how activists are feeling about that. So that was something that kind of struck me. And then the third thing was maybe just to kind of also tip this over to Evan, because your latest article, you kind of end on this point about rethinking food systems and agricultural systems, especially as a moment of potential reflection as well.
And I might actually jump in in response, maybe with a direct question to Tony. You've got this amazing phrase in there where you're talking about, let me find it again, sabotaging the infrastructures for living. And I'm thinking about it in terms of this conversation of food, but also the category of essential work, and this, the concluding gambit of this piece, where you're talking again about sort of the inconsistent and incoherent pandemic response that in effect is a mass killing. You know, so like a lot of folks laboring in meat factories that were forced to stay open, or undocumented, precariously employed agricultural laborers who don't have access to, you know, a driver's license, much less health insurance. You know, you can see Foucault's conspiratorial biopolitics here. So I guess maybe it's an invitation to you to theorize that category of essential work in Corona time.
Yeah, there's no doubt that I mean, I have to say the coincidence was not lost on me. I teach a class at Wesleyan called Metabolism and Technoscience that, you know, explores the kind of, it's almost like a kind of a Marxist STS analysis of metabolic orders, right? From the toxicological to the pharmaceutical to the nutritional and so forth. And, you know, how all these energies and materials pass through each other and create change and create life in all the ways in which that's theorized. As soon, you know, of course, this is the class that was disrupted by the pandemic. And so I was still teaching it while the pandemic was unfolding. And, you know, we had already looked at agriculture. We had already looked at agricultural labor. We had looked at strawberry pickers. We had looked at, you know, the slaughterhouse workers, and had these conversations about just it's almost like I think it's a necrophilic, it's like a death cult. I mean, what the hell, how do you make sense of like just the need for killing? I think it's part of the settler. It's the settler logic, right? The settler logic. It just requires death. This social compact in this country absolutely requires that non-whiteness equals dead, right? So you have to exist in this state of death, and part of the way you achieve that is by sabotaging the systems people need to survive. Water systems, of course, air systems, soil systems, and food systems being, you know, chief among them, medicinal systems as well, pharmaceuticals. So you fuck with all those systems people need to survive, and then you don't actually have to kill them, although they do that as well. You know, you can actually just withdraw support. You know, you can secede from the people, which is what the state has basically done. And by withdrawing all that infrastructure for living, you let people die. I mean, of course, the euphemism about essential workers is that they're really essential for the profit making to continue. But, you know, the people could take those means of production for themselves if they so chose, right? Like we could actually do that. I mean, that's really at the heart of that puzzle. It's like, well, how can you keep it this way and the private property relationship remain intact? You know.
Leo, did you have a question?
Yes, Tony. It's very much connected to what you've just said, and I wonder whether you can draw any resonance or any connections. You know, the thing you mentioned about Trump and the Trump administration stepping back when the stats started reflecting that actually Black and brown bodies are most at risk. It sounds like what friends are saying about Boris Johnson's government and the policies and the policy shift that's happened as those stats keep coming out, considering also that a lot of the health service is staffed by Black and brown, mostly women. And Brazil has a very similar capacity problem. And the policies of stepping back resonate there. So on one level, you can see that as right-wing, strong men, white capitalist men, particularly, who engage in that kind of necropolitics or biopolitics, but it actually expands to India, for example, to where lots of people are dying because they are expendable. And it relates, in fact, to some arguments that were being made by the activist movement in the Thabo Mbeki era, when he was saying medical science doesn't reflect the truth of what the deaths are about, where people were not necessarily dying of HIV, but were dying of underlying causes. And one of the underlying causes in South Africa, which happens to be a gendered and a race disease to this day, is TB. So the idea of breath and breathing as absent in the male population, Black male population, was something that his policies were about. But I'm just wondering now, as you said that, whether you see any connection between these policies of allowing masses and masses of people to be expendable and to die, as not resonating with contemporary government. I mean, that's what allows governments to be able to raise the kind of supports with the funders and with the kind of the groups that they solicit for support are not necessarily looking for the greater good. And in this sense, the greater good being the poorest, the Black and the brown in majority countries that are like that.
I mean, I'm sure others would, in this group, would resonate with what you said. You know, all the cases you cite, they do point to a pattern. How we make sense of that pattern, to me, is the big ticket question, right? Like, how do we make sense of all what appears to be, you know, this coordinated political strategy to allow the coronavirus to take life from certain segments of the population, right? And you know, it's like, what happens, you know, as I've been kind of trying to think about epidemiologically, like what happens when a pandemic hits an endemic, right? I mean, you already had an endemic situation in the United States, at least, and certainly you mentioned TB in South Africa. You had, you know, health conditions that were widely prevalent around the world that, when coronavirus hit, all of a sudden made coronavirus far more deadly in some populations as compared to others, based upon what it seems like we know about what coronavirus does to the body. So, you know, is it possible that there's a coordinated, you know, political effort to allow that mass death to take place? Yes. I mean, damn it. I mean, I feel like, you know, from the immigration restrictions to the claims, and for Trump administration in particular, right? You know, them making the mass loss in health insurance that took place with mass job loss, and then at the same time to go to the Supreme Court and say, we're trying to kill the one mechanism people might have to actually access care during the pandemic. Like, what other, like, I mean, all the evidence I kept seeing suggested that in terms of health policy, the federal government was not just botching the response. It didn't seem to just be like a botched response. It seemed to be like that the decisions that they did make worked in the opposite direction of what you'd want to see. And it's like, well, every decision they made, literally every single decision they made seemed to be to the detriment of Black and brown people and working class people. Every decision. And so what I see at the root of this, in terms of is a crisis in American sovereignty. I mean, this is really what this is. You know, what is U.S. sovereignty anymore? What is the U.S. nation state anymore? And what on God's earth is it doing? You know, it's I think we all know. I feel like I see a pretty clear pattern that this is David Theo Goldberg. Go back to racial states. David Theo Goldberg, you look and see what racist states do, right? When you live in a racist state, that has a very particular meaning for how that state is governed. And that has a particular resonance in terms of health and health policy that I think is largely underexplored, right? In terms of the literature, right? As one intellectual question. I don't think people really quite thought through all the ways in which this mode of governance actually plays out in terms of actual health policy for the United States as a whole. I don't think people have really done that, have bridged those two the health policy, STS, critical theory worlds. I don't think people have really done that. But you better believe, brother, that they are, I think that, the other case, of course, to consider is, of course, in the prison system. What happened to coronavirus in prison system? This is another example, another site where you could examine they were, not the workers themselves, the guards don't even have, from my reporting here in Connecticut, I'm involved with our Center for Prison Education at Wesleyan, and, the guards don't even have masks. Nobody has masks. Everyone's just up in there dying, So you can sense my profound pessimism at the moment. Like, seriously, I'm looking for rays of sunshine. Adriana.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. I just want to, I don't mean to depress anyone, but I just want to echo your pessimism in that regard. From the perspective of Puerto Rico, all of this rings extremely pertinent and is definitely one of the things that Puerto Ricans have been talking about for a while. And in that context, mutual aid has been really the only answer as far as, communities getting organized to try and prevent spread at this moment where we're seeing Puerto Rico becoming one of the fastest growing places with the fastest growing number of cases. We also know that there's barely any contact tracing happening at all in Puerto Rico. So there's in the colonial context, there's the doubling of that question in ways that are extremely painful, but not only is Trump and the US, utilizing their necropolitical imperial neglect to get rid of a population that has been a problem for a long time, but there's also internal dynamics that reproduce that very sort of letting die in the Foucauldian sense, right? From Puerto Ricans towards other Puerto Ricans along the lines of race, class, and social privilege. So I think, you ask, what is the United States doing in Puerto Rico? Ever since Hurricane Maria, the consensus has been that they're trying to get rid of all Puerto Ricans. That seems to be what's going on. But there's this other internal dynamic that is also the result of the long colonial history, right? And that's a really painful question that I think that we grapple with as well. We don't talk about that as openly as we do the one about the imperial relation, right? But thank you for the reflections.
No, yet another. I see this is yet another case, and you can see the Trump administration's strategic decision to abrogate its responsibility. Like, they're literally, even though they have a constitutional responsibility to Puerto Rico.
Yeah, they're trying to sell Puerto Rico, right?
They're trying to sell Puerto Rico.
That's what came out this week. So I wanted to speak to what you said before, that I forgot to mention this, that in my own work, I've been elaborating this notion of the coloniality of health in Puerto Rico to try and bring out precisely those dimensions that you were talking about with regards to the history of science and the sort of intersection of public health and the question of sovereignty in this colonial context. So yeah, I was very interested in what you were talking about there too.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments very much, and I think that that the question of U.S. sovereignty and how it's wielding it, is to me, there's no longer an open question. We should be moving on with how we respond to it, at this point. But I just want to give nod to what Rachel and Adriana both have said in terms of mutual aid, and that's, I think people are all, any system of power people are going to respond to it. And in fact, the system of power, if you follow Cedric Robinson, Black Marxism, it's actually the system of power is created to subordinate what are inherently a free people from Jump Street. It's not like the system of power is in place. He argued that racial capitalism wasn't necessary. It didn't start with racial capitalism and then everyone is adjusting to it. He said this order emerged specifically to negate Black freedom and to specifically like in response to it. And so, I think that like this moment too, people are responding in ways to care for each other that are novel and that are innovative and that, as we'll see, will get folded into other systems and re-articulated in other ways that are unhelpful. But hopefully we can hang on to them in ways, so we can figure out what to do next. I mean, I think it's beyond my expertise to say whether we're in one of those like big time transitional moments. I'm not sure, maybe, but I don't know. That's a hard question for me. They got a lot of guns.
Tony, do you have time for one more question?
I do.
I mean, I've got a question, but also do other people want to ask? Because I've already asked a lot of questions. Okay, I'll ask my question. Yeah, so before everybody else got on the line, we were talking about propaganda, and in the same way that Althusser and Stuart Hall have theorized ideology, I think in this piece you're recovering a Black genealogy of propaganda. And to me, this is some of the to get out to not end on a pessimistic note. Like, this is a note where I think we could all be more I guess clever and savvy at living with propaganda as as it's emanating and articulating with a white nationalist agenda, but also doing our own work of propaganda, and would just love to hear you say a little bit more about where you're headed with this idea of embracing a politics of propaganda.
I mean, I see this, one of the places I see this seriously is in hip hop culture, right? Hip hop culture and Black culture, right? Artistic forms, right? Poetry, you see this people producing this counter story, right? It's a little boastful, and sometimes it's a little braggadocious, sometimes it's not exactly accurate, right? But there's a pushback, a resilience, a life affirming push that comes in these other forms. And so I think about, I could actually, I want to just get distracted and show you. I'll point everybody to it on the listserv. But with some students a few years ago, and this all these different pieces that you guys have read for today are folding into what I have I'm calling like the Black Phoenix Rising Project, which is I can point you to and you can take a look at. But it started with some students at Wesleyan a couple of years ago at the Center for the Humanities. We really tried to think beyond necropolitics, right? Like, so you got a necropolitical situation. They're killing us. Okay, well then what, right? So how do you rethink that? And so this project was designed for me to kind of think through how Black resistance, Black cultural expression, spiritual life, scientific production all worked to, not just let death be the last word. Like, racism tried to, it no doubt is killing us, right? But we in some ways that death then is not the end, right? So from like the makeshift memorial and the power it can create in a community, right? After a baby is killed, everybody galvanizes and organizes, and we get new community coming out of that death, right? Out of all, in terms of health, right? All this focus on, so I see these as very much connected. And part of that project, we created what we called ransom notes. So one of our students was a coder, and she taught us all how to manipulate HTML code. So we would go to a website for an institution of power, say the FBI, and we would manipulate the visual fields of the HTML code to make the document appear to say something that it in fact did not say. So we took, for example, y'all remember when Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, the then Attorney General of the United States, designated Black Lives Matter as a terrorist group. Remember that? Right? This is a few years ago now. Seems like a lifetime ago, but this happened. And they produced this report. So we took that report and we turned it into a ransom note, right? Where we went in, and so instead of Federal Bureau of Investigation, it's Federal Bureau of Instigation. and then we change the text to really, to invert the meaning. Again, it's propaganda, right? We're definitely not telling the truth here. This is, there's no such, it's fiction. It's satire, but it's pushing back at the absurdity of what they said in the first place. And so, and again, this was a student idea that really culminated in several different ransom notes. We did our own university president. We did Trump, a couple, a few for him too. And so that's kind of where I think that's much more life affirming for me, to think about the creative dimension, the humorous, the cultural, and maybe this speaks to what Du Bois was on, right? I mentioned that in the piece, that Du Bois in the Souls of Black Folk, the first line in the Souls of Black Folk is a stanza of music, right? It's not words, right? It's literally, right, from this song, and that the embeddedness of the modes of cultural expression in that particular Black radical tradition was something that I think is really important, and something I'd like to see people in STS try to do in interesting ways, and really not even connected to STS. I don't owe STS any money, so I don't owe any allegiance to them as a field. But I think that, in terms of creating work that connects to people and that feels life affirming in this moment, that's kind of where I think I might be going.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. This has been really enlightening, and I'm delighted to discover a fellow troublemaker. So next week we've got a medical historian who's returning to talk with us more, Antoine Johnson, as well as two historians and medical clinicians, Michelle Ongwale of Johns Hopkins, and Lakshmi Krishnan, who used to be at Johns Hopkins, but I understand she's just moved to Georgetown. So we're meeting at 10:30 East Coast time, a little bit earlier. So those of you in California are going to have to wake up at the crack of dawn and get some espresso. But yeah, it's the piece that we read. One of the pieces by Tony today mentioned the 1918 influenza outbreak and how race played out in that. So Michelle and Lakshmi's piece really gets inside of that and looks at this cordon sanitaire that was associated with segregation. But yeah, basically how they're insisting that this is nothing new that we're living through now. That earlier pandemic resulted in 1 million deaths. We're not there yet. This isn't unprecedented. So we can turn to history to think about the present, but also, conditions of possibility for any future. So thanks again, Tony. I love both these pieces, and it's great to have you as an interlocutor for the day.
Thank you all, and it's good to meet all of you, and reach out if you want to talk further, for sure.
And to everyone who helped mediate this encounter, I think we did it right this time. We sent out the link. You had to be one of the cool kids to get the link. So I think we're doing it right. We were ready for the trolls. They didn't come back. But yeah, let's keep this sort of mutual aid community network going. So thanks again, Tony. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tony.